In today's video, the 3 areas in central Toronto where the average sold price year to date in the year 2021, according to the Toronto real estate market, is less than $1 million. So in other words, we're going to go through the 3 cheapest areas in the city of Toronto. Hello everyone, this is Sam from SaberiSixRealEstate and Remax, Realtron, Realty Inc. As always, you can find my contact information in terms of my office information, my Instagram, and my Gmail in the description box. Feel free to get in touch with me with any questions you may have with regards to any topics covered in this video, any topics covered in previous videos, or if you have any general inquiries with regards to the Toronto/GTA real estate market. Lastly, as a point of order, feel free to subscribe, comment, rate, and review. Your support in that regard is greatly appreciated, but you're not obliged to do so. I have a members only poll up on my channel for the next Toronto condo review, where I go through a 15 to 25 minute thorough review of some of the more popular, for good and bad reasons, Toronto condominiums and give you my opinion on them. So feel free to go vote on that poll as well. Enough of that, let's get to the point of today's video, which, as I said off the top, is the 3 cheapest areas in Toronto Central. So central Toronto, we're not accounting for east side of Toronto, we're not accounting for the west side of Toronto. I'll do those in separate videos. But basically, we're going to the average year-to-date price. So this is being recorded in November of 2021. We only have 10 full months of sales data available to us. So basically, when we say year to date, we meet from January 1st of 2021 to the end of October of 2021 in terms of average sold price, which areas were the cheapest. And when we apply this criteria, there are only 3 areas in central Toronto that have an average sold price of less than $1 million. Now, before we go through the areas and give you quick background as to why these areas are as cheap as they are, obviously we're using the word cheap relative to Toronto real estate, which is still pretty pricey, but below $1 million, the only 3 areas below $1 million. Why these are those areas? Let me clarify a couple of things. First and foremost, we're going based on the TREB codes. As always, if you're confused as to what the TREB codes are, there's a link in the description that takes you to the TREB maps, an active map, interactive map, where in the top right corner, you can activate the map according to communities and municipalities. And if you click on the municipalities button, you get to see what these codes, these C's, these W's, these E's designate, because we're going to go through in this video according to the TREB code. So for your reference, the link is in the description. And lastly, defining our criteria and our scope of search, we're only talking about Toronto Central, as I previously said. So what does that mean? All the C's, C1, C2, C4, C8, C11, C15, none of the W's and none of the E's. Once again, if you're confused by this, this will be further illuminated for you if you do go refer to that map. And once we do look at the central parts of Toronto, only 3 areas, as I previously mentioned, have an average sold price of less than $1 million year to date. So this accounts for all property types, right? Anything from condos to semi-detached to condo townhomes to fully detached 2-story and detached bungalows, basically all property. Anyways, enough of that. Let's get to the 3 areas. And one of the only 3 areas that had an average sold price of $1 million was C1, which you can think of as central downtown Toronto. Year to date, having the average sold price of $857,000 based upon almost 6,000 transactions, to be precise, 5,993 transactions. Now, it may surprise some that the average sold price in C1 is around $850,000, and B, it's one of the cheapest areas in the state of Toronto with regards to being one of the 3 only areas year to date that's below $1 million in average sold price. It might surprise some, and the reason it might surprise some is because, well, it's downtown Toronto, is as central as you can get and as southern as you can get, some of the most desirable locations, both in terms of investment purposes and end user purposes, is downtown. Not for everyone, of course, but for a majority of the people out there. But once we actually dig into C1, it should not be surprising to you why it's actually one of the cheaper areas, the cheapest areas in the city of Toronto across all property types, and year to date, of course, one of the only areas that's been below $1 million. What do I mean by that? Well, let's break it down a little bit further. Remember, I said this is across all property types, so it counts for every single property type. But C1 is very, very condo rich, meaning of all the inventory that's available on the market and of all the transactions that have occurred in 2021 or any given point in time, a large majority of those transactions and those listings and that inventory will be condominiums. And condominiums as a property type, as a class of property, are the cheapest. Naturally speaking, if an area is very condo rich and condos make up a significant portion of the transactions, as a result, even if those condominiums are expensive and as a condo market, it's more expensive than other areas, when we're looking at across property types, it's going to have a negative impact on the average sold price and it's going to carry down the average. Whereas another area that's less desirable but has more freehold properties and less condominiums, even if the freehold properties in that area are of a lesser desirable variety, naturally speaking, the average selling price will still be higher than an area full of higher desirable condominiums. When we break down C1 downtown Toronto with regards to its condo market and its freehold market, overall with regards to the real estate market in C1, we see what freehold properties do exist, and there is some freehold properties. It's not as if it's all condominiums. It is mostly allocated towards Trinity Bellwoods, Little Italy, Little Portugal, Kensington, Chinatown. You do have some in Niagara, of course, you do have some in Waterfront, very few, but most of the freehold selections in downtown C1 are in those aforementioned communities. If we're exclusively looking at single family freehold properties and sales year to date in C1, single family freehold properties make up around 500 of these sales that we're looking at, where we're looking at here, once again, around 5,000. And of those, when we're looking at the most expensive and the most desirable of freehold properties and all properties detached, that makes up even less of a share of all the properties, wherein we're only looking at 104 that sold year to date in 2021 with regards to C1 downtown. But what freehold properties do exist here, especially detached, especially 2-story, in some cases 3-story, are some of the most expensive in the city of Toronto. And this helps me segue into my last point. The point here is you have some of the most expensive freehold properties that are very minimal in nature, and then you have some of the cheapest condominiums available in the city of Toronto on the condo side of things. Thus, the range, simply put in terms of price, is far more expensive in central Toronto, downtown C1, than any other area really in Ontario. So to illustrate this point a little bit further, the most expensive sold across all property types in C1 downtown Toronto year to date, so thus far in 2021, was for $5,999,000, so close to $6 million. It was a detached property in Spadina Avenue. So this establishes the highest sold at 5.99 million, whereas the cheapest sold in the same area, C1, in the same time period, was a condominium that sold for around $312,000, belonging to the building of 1 King Street. So this large, humongous gap between the lowest sold and the highest sold, going from $300,000 with regards to a bachelor condominium in 1 King Street to a $6 million detached home on Spadina Avenue that is heritage. Here once again, we can hopefully see why the average is lower than you would expect, because there is a lot of data in between this large range that typically skews towards the lower end. Anyways, that's for C1. Where else in the city of Toronto, year to date, do we see an average sold price of below 1 million, making it one of the 3 cheapest areas in central Toronto? Well, the neighbor of C1, C8, which also is downtown Toronto. Here, the average is even less than C1, coming in at an average sold price year to date of $792,000 based on 2,000 transactions, to be more precise, 2,700 transactions. And here, many of the points we made with C1 still stand with regards to C8, and even more to the point, are further exasperate. Because first and foremost, when we look at C8 on a map, it's smaller than C1, right? C1 is more expansive in terms of pure surface area. C8 is much smaller and much more rectangular-like, thus there's less ample land for freehold properties and also condominiums as well. Further to the point, both in terms of condos and freehold, but we'll take freehold first. What freehold single-family properties do exist in C8, much like C1, is far more minimal compared to the condominium inventory. But unlike C1, C8's freehold single-family inventory is even less, and also even less desirable. Once again, this is all relatively speaking, right? Like there's a lot of good freehold options in C8 and C1. When I say less desirable, for most people, they're highly desirable. But when compared to the higher end freehold properties in C1, they're a little less. Let's just, keep that into context, please. Nonetheless, same thing applies with the condominium market. Here, the condominium market is thought to be cheaper, and it is, both in terms of median and average sold price, than C1, and it has overall less desirable options. Once again, there's a lot of great options within C8. In fact, C8 is home to a lot of growing condo communities that I think are really good buy low opportunities right now. But there's definitely less development in C8. That's why a lot of builders and developers who are running out of lots and lands in C1 of downtown, they're actually taking their business in C8 because there's still a lot of not vacant land, but a lot of parking lots, a lot of gas stations, a lot of rental apartments that can be bought out. Safe to say there's a far more development opportunity that exists in C8, and that goes to explaining partially why the average sold prices, both in terms of condominiums and in terms of freehold properties, are less. So illuminating the point further, there was only 157 single family freehold properties that were sold year to date in C8, wherein when we looked at the same number in C1, it was higher, albeit once again, yes, lower than any other area, but compared to C8, higher. And of this 157 single family freehold properties that were sold, only about 16 of them were detached. Most others were either semis or townhomes, which are obviously, as a class of property, less expensive than detached. So we can even say not only does C8 have less freehold properties than C1 does relative to the amount of condominiums, but the freehold properties here are even less of a detached variety, wherein C1 has more detached, which has a higher impact on price. Here there's less detached, more townhomes, more semis of lower price points, not only for those property types, but even condominiums. Thus, as a result, why we see the average sold price to be the cheapest within central Toronto year to date at $792,000. And if we take the same exercise and we try to establish a range here, as we did with C1, we see the lowest sold was for $349,000 in a very old condominium, whereas the highest sold was not upwards of 5 or 4 million, but year to date, the highest sold was one of the rare detached properties, one of those 16 detached properties that sold for $3.425 million. That sold for $3.425 million on Wellesley Street East. So the higher end of price points is lower, but the lower end of price points is a bit higher because, frankly speaking, a C8 is less ample in terms of studios and bachelors, which are the cheapest properties that you can find, whereas C1 has more studios and bachelors. And lastly, let's get into the other area, the third area that is below an average sold price of $1 million year to date, making it one of the 3 cheapest areas in central Toronto according to average sold price, which is C15, an area I've spoke about many times on this channel. When it comes to condominiums, I'm personally not the biggest fan of C15 condominiums, mainly the inventory that exists around Shepherd and Don Mills or Shepherd and Victoria Park. I think it's far too saturated. I don't think it's good from an end user's perspective, and I think it does suffer from some poor city planning and a lot of the builds in that area. Once again, I'm not a big fan of. C15 of course belongs to North York. Here the average sold price is $892,000. I should have mentioned off the bat, based on 1,700 transactions. Now the condos that exist in this area are far cheaper in average and median than the condos in C8 and C1, but this area is far more ample in terms of single family freehold properties. Hence why the average here is higher than C1 and C8. Thus, we can't exclusively judge based on the price, right? It's not as if it's more desirable overall than C1 and C8. It's just the condos here. It's just that condos here make up less of a share of all the available sales and transactions and inventory, although it is the third most rich condo area in the city of Toronto with regards to central Toronto. Having said that, nonetheless, there's more freehold properties to carry up the average than there are in C1 and C8, and less condominiums. But what condominiums do exist, once again, I personally find to be inferior options when compared to C1 and C8. Anyways, that's a quick rundown of the 3 cheapest areas year to date in the city of Toronto, and all these areas are the only areas in central Toronto that have an average selling price less than $1 million so far year to date. And all these areas, coincidentally, are the only areas that have an average selling price of less than $1 million year to date. Anyways, that's Sam from Saberi Real Estate, RE/MAX Realtron Realty Inc. Let me know if you have any further questions about anything discussed on this video or any other video. Feel free to subscribe, comment, rate, and review. I really appreciate the fact that you take the time out of your day to watch these videos, and I hope these videos are informative for you. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and stay tuned. Thank you.